Good morning. I'm Lisa Lindsley, the Director of Investor Engagement for Majority Action, and welcome to the member-hosted panel, Call and Response, what should shareholders do when companies fail to heed a majority vote, fail to adequately implement a majority vote of shareholders. A few housekeeping notes. Our team will be circulating sign-in sheets in a bit, so we'd really love it if you could just give us your name and email so we can follow up with you. We have a table in the back of research, including the exempt solicitation that Majority Action filed regarding 2 directors at Chevron yesterday, and materials and investor advisory from Investor Advocates for Social Justice on Wendy's, our list of companies against which we are recommending majority vote director votes for the chair of the board and the lead independent director for failure to adequately manage climate risk. And then we will also have a few copies of our research reports, Climate in the Boardroom, which is a report on asset manager voting on climate risk, Equity in the Boardroom, which is asset manager voting on racial justice, and Fulfilling the Promise, which is our most recent report from February on the voting track record of the largest members of the Climate Action 100 Plus initiative. I'm going to ask our, we have a number of new teammates here today, so Ivy Schlegel and Pilar Sorensen are in the back. Feel free to introduce yourself. They're part of our research team. Bryant and Terry have just entered the room. They are also part of our team. So please feel free to ask them any questions you might have about Majority Action. With that, we're going to kick it off. We're pleased to be joined today by Edgar Hernández from SEIU and Gina Falada from Investor Advocates for Social Justice. They will each talk about the proposals of which they were the proponents. And then Eli Kasargod-Staub, who's the Executive Director of Majority Action, will cover the proposal at Chevron because the proponents of that proposal were unable to be with us today. Also, another housekeeping note on Q&A, we will have live Q&A with a microphone at the end of the session after each speaker has made their remarks. And the Q&A function on the CII app has been disabled, but for those of you who are watching online, you can ask your questions in the Zoom and we'll do our best to get to those. So we've taken some data from a report that Morningstar did. Jackie Cook at Morningstar has done a pretty interesting coverage of the rising levels of support for shareholder proposals, environmental and social. For S&P 500 companies last year, 58 proposals received a majority vote, which is definitely a record. And so that kind of brings up the question of then what, right? And so the impact, many of us in this room have spent decades filing and campaigning for votes on shareholder proposals, and without really ever expecting to receive a majority vote. And it's been a way to flag issues of risks related to corporate performance and to generate a greater dialogue between investors and companies. But now that the proposals are getting majority vote, if companies fail to implement them, what recourse do investors have? And I think that you'll hear from some of the panelists that the philosophy or the idea of filing a shareholder proposal to generate improved corporate performance and mitigate risk is only as good as the intention of the company to implement it. And if that fails to happen, then shareholders are left with no recourse other than to hold the board accountable. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Edgar Hernández.
Thank you, Lisa. Good morning. Can everyone hear me? Great. So I'm going to start off by just sharing our experiences in terms of when we've engaged the private prison industry, more specifically around the GEO group. And so this is really part of the work that we as SEIU have been engaged in for quite some time. And more specifically, back in the fall of 2017, we convened a panel at the San Diego CII conference, where really we outlined the issues related to investors and the risks posed to them by the immigration policies that were being put forth and put in place by the previous administration. And it really impacted one of the industries, and more specifically as it relates to the private prison industry. And it became more acutely aware in terms of just how this concern was going to come to bear, mainly because in April of 2018, the previous administration began the family separation policy. And for some of you who don't know what that is, it basically called for children that cross into the U.S. seeking asylum with their parents or with their guardians. In some of those instances, the children were separated and they were placed in separate detention facilities away from their parents or guardians. And then unfortunately, in other instances, the parents or guardians were deported back to their countries of origin, leaving their children behind. And so in January of 2019, the previous administration acknowledged that there were several thousand children that had been separated. At that point in time, the estimates were about 2,737 children, but the exact number is not known. And so the current administration has begun the effort to go ahead and try to reunite the children with their parents and guardians, and the process is ongoing. And so as investors of both the GEO Group and Core Civic, we were concerned about the roles that these companies may have played in this particular policy that was put in place by the previous administration. And so this really created a lot of headline risk for these companies, and it prompted some institutional investors to go ahead and sell their shares of both the GEO Group and Core Civic. And so just for example, back in 2017 of April, GEO Group shares were trading at approximately $33 a share. And as of this morning, they're down to $5.64. S&P back in January of this year downgraded their outlook to triple C status. So doesn't look good for the GEO Group at this point in time. And so the effort that we engaged in order to try to go ahead and address some of these concerns as it relates to the investment issues, we were part of a group of investors that came out of the ICCR working group that filed a resolution at the GEO Group to ask them to go ahead and issue a report on how they, as a company, were making sure that their employees were implementing their human rights policy. When it came to the shareholder meeting and we actually saw the result, we received 83% of shareholder support, which was a resounding number in terms of just where we were at it with this particular resolution. And so it's not clear to me, in speaking with others from this particular group of organizations that co-filed this resolution, that the actual content has ever really been made public by the company in terms of just what the findings and recommendations are. And so we were really concerned about that. And so in 2020, we as SEIU Master Trust then went ahead and filed on our own a political spending and lobbying disclosure proposal at the GEO Group that basically asking them to update their policy. The company then went ahead and pursued a no action request at the SEC, but thankfully that request was denied. And the proposal went on to receive 42% of shareholder support. And so we thought that this was going to be enough for the company to engage us in a conversation to discuss what our concerns and recommendations are. And unfortunately, our attempts to go ahead and have these conversations with GEO Group were rebuffed. We then went back again in 2021 and refiled the same proposal, and we did so with the Oregon Treasurer Reed and the Oregon Investment Council. And prior to the AGM, the company actually did update their policy, and when we looked at it, we still felt that it wasn't enough, that there were still some holes in that policy. And, my quick thought was like, well, they put something out there right before the shareholder meeting. Our proposal is probably not going to do as good as, we did last year with 42%. But much to my delight and surprise, we got 67% of shareholder support last year. And so that was really exciting at many levels. And I really firmly believe that at this point in time, that the company was going to go ahead and engage us. I emailed pretty much everybody who I could email in the company, from the general counsel to senior staff to whomever, and their outside counsel as well, asking them for a meeting. And it was approximately on the third attempt that we got a response saying that, no, we're okay, we're good. We're going to update this prior to releasing our annual report this year. So just, watch out for that. And I didn't think that was an adequate response, especially after we got 67% of shareholder support. And it just really felt like, as investors, we were being treated, we didn't have anything to contribute. So we are now in the process of actually moving forward we're in the process of finalizing our research to go ahead and run a withhold campaign on one or several of the GEO group directors. And I would encourage folks to just stay in touch for that as we go ahead and then circulate the information for those that are invested in GEO groups so that we can hopefully get your support. Thank you, Lisa.
Sure, thanks, Edgar. And yeah, that's a really, really excellent example of repeated year after year after year failure to engage and failure to implement the will of shareholders. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Gina Falada.
Thank you, Lisa. Can everyone hear me? So I first wanted to say thank you to the Majority Action Team and CII for inviting me to speak today. And I wanted to briefly introduce Investor Advocates for Social Justice, since this is our first time at CII. So we're a nonprofit representing faith-based institutional investors in shareholder advocacy, mission-aligned investing activities, and proxy voting to advance human rights, climate justice, racial equity, and peace. We engage on behalf of the lead proponent of the 2021 Wendy's shareholder proposal, the Franciscan Sisters of Allegheny, New York, a congregation of women religious leveraging their shares in Wendy's to advocate for the rights of farm workers on the front lines. So for today's panel, I'll be speaking about holding the Wendy's board accountable for their insufficient response to the shareholder proposal supported by 95% of shares voted in 2021. And the proposal was titled Protecting Essential Food Chain Worker Rights During COVID-19. And this was a historic majority vote for a proposal on a human rights topic. So I first wanted to briefly go over the human rights risks that we're seeking to address through the shareholder proposal. So it is widely documented that there are severe worker rights violations in North American agricultural supply chains, and workers were at high exposure risks to COVID-19. Other human rights at risk include forced labor, sexual harassment, exposure to increasing heat stress as the effects of climate change continue to increase. And Wendy's was a particular focused company for shareholder engagement due to their resistance to stakeholder calls for Wendy's to join peers in joining the award-winning Fair Food program led by the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. So, to briefly explain the ask of the proposal, it's summarized here on this slide. So we are requesting a report addressing both the supplier code and the extent to which Wendy's quality assurance audits and third-party reviews were effectively protecting workers in Wendy's food supply chains from human rights violations, including the harms associated with COVID-19. And this was obviously our first time filing this proposal with Wendy's, but had previously engaged through investor letter writing with fellow ICCR members and as well as state treasurers. So some of the pieces of disclosure we were looking for in the requested report was for Wendy's to disclose whether they require their suppliers in the agricultural supply chain to enforce COVID-19 safety protocols for their workforce, any cases of supplier suspensions for non-compliance with Wendy's human rights expectations for suppliers, a list of their approved third-party human rights auditors, the frequency of audits, the number of audited locations, and the number of worker interviews during audits, because that direct worker voice is really important to the quality of those audits. And then finally, what access to a third-party grievance mechanism would be for supply chain workers. So the next slide, please. So for Wendy's response to the 2021 shareholder proposal, the company first filed a no action request at the SEC, and the SEC ruled in favor of the proponent. And then Wendy's had sent us a planned board statement of opposition to the proposal, which we had expected based on their no action request. And then by the time of the proxy publishing, they'd actually changed their view, and the board was recommending a vote in support of the supply chain worker rights proposal, and had indicated that they had planned to release new disclosure in their future sustainability reporting. So after that change, I think as the proponents, we had hoped that Wendy's would be more responsive to our request to engage on this issue. But surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, there was really no transparency after the AGM, despite outreach by us on behalf of the proponents multiple times, and not too far out from the AGM, we were thinking about organizing another investor letter to Wendy's to state our concerns about non-responsiveness to the majority vote, since we hadn't seen that new disclosure published yet. And then kind of as a surprise, Wendy's did put out a brief report that was aiming to respond to the proposal, but we were not engaged on the content, and were not even notified directly when it was published. So we found that the report that Wendy's put out was extremely non-responsive to the requests of the proposal, and I will next go through why. Thank you. So first off, the proposal that Wendy's published omitted key information about their supply chain monitoring efforts, including key aspects that were outlined in the resolve clause of the proposal. So that included the list of third-party auditors approved to conduct human rights audits, the number of suppliers audited, and number of worker interviews. The only number that was disclosed was the number of supplier locations. It was also extremely non-responsive about the company's exposure in their supply chain to increasing risks of forced labor in North American agricultural supply chains. There are recently multiple law enforcement actions involving forced labor on farms in both the United States and Mexico, and Wendy's has historically sourced tomatoes from both countries. Next, Wendy's actually admitted in the report that they had not implemented any new requirements for their suppliers on COVID safety protections for their supplier workforce, which is extremely concerning to investors given the high rates of COVID exposure to agricultural workers. So as a wrap up, based on this information that investors have from the report that Wendy's did put out, we believe that their existing practices for monitoring and enforcement of human rights expectations for their suppliers pale in comparison to the Coalition of Immokalee Workers Fair Food Program, which is an effective worker-led monitoring program that Wendy's is lagging its peers in joining. So major retailers and fast food brands have joined, and Wendy's is really lagging and not being a part of it. So next slide. So next I'll go through some of the guarantees that come with being a member of the CIW's Fair Food Program, and it will be clear why we've been encouraging Wendy's to join alongside other workers and investors. So the Fair Food Program, first off, requires and enforces mandatory COVID-19 protocols on participating Fair Food Program farms, which was proven to be effective in reducing COVID rates among the workforce. Second, the CIW and the Fair Food Standards Council have developed what's called the Fair Food Code of Conduct, which has a zero tolerance for forced labor on participating farms. And what the zero tolerance looks like is non-compliant growers are suspended, and any participating buyers, which are the brand companies, are required to end their purchasing from any suspended farms. So there's a real accountability mechanism there with the Fair Food Code of Conduct. Next, there's an independent Fair Food Standards Council, which is an independent nonprofit that is the sole approved auditor to conduct human rights audits at participating FFP farms. And participating farms are audited annually, including on-site interviews with at least 50% of the workers present at that time. So there's a real assurance that worker voice is captured in those on-site audits. Next, there's a 24/7 worker complaint hotline that's answered by an independent human rights investigator, which is really unique to this program compared to like other corporate-based hotlines. And then finally, through that hotline and other mechanisms, there's an effective grievance procedure that's very responsive to those worker reports of any human rights abuses. And it's been able to resolve over 3,100 complaints since this program launched in 2011. So now I'll be speaking briefly about our investor call to action to hold the board accountable at Wendy's. So if you're a shareholder in Wendy's and part of that 95% that supported the human rights proposal, we're calling on investors to use their leverage through proxy voting to vote against either directors on the CSR committee, potentially the chair of the board. We're in a similar state as Edgar, where we're still in the research process before we put out any recommendations, but we'll have more information for forthcoming about our recommendations. Second, I'd encourage everyone to review a report that's in the back of the room, an investor advisory that we put out with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers that has in-depth information on Wendy's non-responsiveness, as well as additional information about the Fair Food Program and its successes over the years. And another thing besides the investor advisory that we're launching today is that the New York City Comptroller and a coalition of state treasurers put out a letter to Wendy's today about the non-responsive report and indicating their plans to factor this into their proxy voting decisions at the next annual meeting. So that's all I have for today.
Thank you, Gina. And where could people go if they want to see that letter from the state treasurer, from the controller Lander? Is that a public letter?
Yes, and there will be press release about it on both the IESJ website and I believe the CIW page as well. It came out this morning right before the panel, so look for that.
Great. Okay, so before we go to our next speaker, I just wanted to remind folks that there are sign-in sheets circulating, and also Bryant and Ivy, do you mind holding up some of the reports that we have in the back of the room? So we have equity in the boardroom, fulfilling the promise, which is our Climate Action 100 Plus voting report, and climate in the boardroom, as well as our filing on Chevron, our list of proxy voting for 1.5 degree world companies for 2022, and the Wendy's investor advisory that came out today. So our next company is Chevron. And before I turn it over to Eli, I just wanted to mention, Gina, you mentioned that ISJ also has a racial equity audit proposal at Chevron.
Yes,
Right.
so we do, and it's going to a vote this season,
Mhm.
and it primarily focuses on environmental justice impacts, community impacts of the company's emission and pollution incidents.
Great, thank you. So I'm now going to turn it over to Eli Kasargod-Staub, the Executive Director of Majority Action, to talk about Chevron. Eli?
Tremendous. Hi, can everybody hear me okay? Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to everybody who's joined us on Zoom. Deep thank you to CII for hosting this panel and for so many years being a leader in championing the need for companies to be responsive to majority vote shareholder proposals. I am Eli Kasargod-Staub. I am the Executive Director of Majority Action, which is a nonprofit shareholder advocacy organization dedicated to holding corporate boards accountable to high standards of long-term value creation and social responsibility and corporate governance. And we work very closely with institutional investors and advocacy organizations on efforts to enhance that level of company performance and board oversight on matters related to climate change, racial equity and justice, and democracy and workers' rights. We are really in an inescapable conversation right now in this very moment about energy and the future of energy. It is impossible for any of us this morning not to have encountered news and conversation about all of the incredible turmoil that is happening in the energy markets right now. And so you would be forgiven in this moment for missing the fact that the IPCC, the United Nations body that governs and produces scientific research around climate change, put out its most damning report ever last week, demonstrating beyond any shadow of a doubt that runaway climate change is already causing dangerous levels of harm and both ecological and social disruption, and that we are literally nearing the limits of both social systems and ecosystems' abilities to withstand the kinds of pressures emerging from that kind of runaway climate change. And that once again, we have but few scant years to actually reverse course and get on the level of get aligned with an energy transition, aligned to the goals of the Paris Agreement in time to avert the worst ravages of that crisis. And so the headlines that we're seeing right now are around the turmoil in the energy markets are simultaneously as much a short-term, the product of short-term pressures and responses, frankly, the cost and disruption of what it means to stand up to Putin's tyranny, as they are the long-term product of European companies and governments' failure to heed the calls of responsible investors and advocates to actually undertake the level of clean energy transition that was needed in Europe, that has been needed in Europe, simultaneously to be able to achieve energy independence and to be able to mitigate these risks of climate change. Now, we all just heard, anyone who was here 2 days ago and attended the plenary heard from a director of the Chevron Corporation who stood in front of the entire plenary room full of investors and stated that the International Energy Agency says that fossil fuels will make up to 80% of the energy mix by 2050. The IEA actually says in both its below 2 degree scenarios and its latest net zero scenario that fossil fuel use plummets as a total share of energy use in these kinds of energy transition scenarios. In the net zero scenario, according to the IEA, fossil fuels fall from 80% of the energy system approximately to about 20% of the energy system. And so for those reasons, responsible investors for years have been pursuing dialogue and engagement with energy companies in order to both understand how they themselves would be addressing the fundamental shifts and risks to their own business models, as well as how they were going to start acting in line with the needs for that kind of alignment, such that we would not blow past 1.5 degrees of warming. Next slide, please. The slides here, by the way, are excerpts from the exempt solicitation that is in the back of the room. So that's why shareholders have been engaging for many years with companies like Chevron. And that is why last year, 61% of voting shareholders at Chevron voted in support of a proposal calling on the company to substantially reduce, you see that right there in the resolve clause, substantially reduce their scope 3 emissions. Scope 3, of course, is emissions resulting from the use of products or elsewhere in the company's supply chain. Next slide, please. Chevron responded by declaring a net zero ambition, not a target, but an ambition for its scope 1 and 2 emissions, which represent effectively the company's internal operations, which of course represent a tiny fraction of the company's actual emissions, and a target to reduce by 2028 greenhouse gas emissions intensity of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions by about 5% by 2028. Now, this is both directly non-responsive to the resolve clause of the proposal, in that it does not describe how they would substantially reduce scope 3 emissions medium and long term for the company, particularly long term. It also leaves some very disturbing kind of wiggle room for how the company can be operating, including that 5% reduction doesn't even necessarily guarantee any absolute emissions reductions in scope 3 because of how those scope 3 emissions could play versus the company's scope 1 and 2 emissions. Said simply, this is a recipe for business as usual from Chevron. This is what it looks like. This is what it sounds like for business as usual from Chevron. And as much as other companies in the oil sector still have significant room to shift, Chevron is now lagging even further behind, particularly key European peers in how it's responded. Next slide, please. Meanwhile, energy experts project, meanwhile, the company continues to project ongoing growth in production at exactly the moment when energy experts are predicting that for a company to be able to align, a company like Chevron to be able to align to a Paris compliance scenario, there needs to be absolute and very significant reductions in production in order to actually reduce emissions in line with that target. Now, the Chevron director who spoke here the other day did not know who Carbon Tracker was when a question came up about it. Many of you do know who Carbon Tracker is. They're the analysis group that is really the progenitor of analysis around the notion of the carbon bubble, and has really driven a global conversation around stranded asset risk. They produce analysis of plans like Chevron's, as you can see right here, what the consequences of those are. And they're also a core data provider to Climate Action 100+ in their benchmarking studies of companies like Chevron. Next slide, please. Chevron's, this slide is really only to note that there was kind of a widespread backlash to Chevron's announcements from analysts, and the proponent, our friends at Ceres had something to say about this as well. Again, all of this is contained in the deck. And so for the sake of time, I'd like to keep moving forward. This slide is here to note that Chevron's non-responsiveness to this last year's proposal really builds on their prior year non-responsiveness as well. There was a majority vote on a proposal in 2020 from proponents calling on the company to disclose how they would be aligning their lobbying activities toward the goal of the company, toward the goal of the Paris Agreement. I'm sorry, unfortunately, while Chevron did produce a report, Influence Map, which is once again one of the core Climate Action 100+ data providers that analyzes how well companies are aligning their lobbying activities to the goals of the Paris Agreement, found very significant and ongoing issues with Chevron's actual alignment, in the sense that they produced the report, but did not actually take the actions that the report called upon, that the resolution called upon them to do. Next slide, please. Now, what we are seeking, and many other shareholders are seeking, is a level of robust and independent and climate competent board oversight of Chevron. Chevron is a company where the CEO is also the chair of the board, and so that already obviates some of the kind of independent oversight that one could get from a board of directors. The lead independent director, Ron Sugar, has a 17-year tenure at the company. He serves on the boards of 3 other publicly traded corporations, including as the chair of the board of Uber, and has myriad other non-public company corporate leadership positions, all of which, of course, is again documented in the exempt solicitation. And the board overall has a level of outside board interlocks that also raise the potential for undermining the kind of robust and independent kind of oversight that we desperately need from companies like Chevron. These kinds of outside commitments lead board directors to have to factor in issues and relationships that are outside of the immediate set of issues facing the immediate company. It's not that they can never appear, but when you have a company with this level of challenge, this level of a transition urgency, and this level of, frankly, board sidestepping that kind of effort, this raises very serious concerns. So last slide, please. We are calling on shareholders to use proxy voting power to hold the board accountable for these repeated failures to align to both the objectives of the Paris Agreement and to heed majority vote shareholder proposals and adequately respond to them. We are signaling 2 votes, one on Michael Wirth, who is the CEO and chairman. We are not, it should be clear, seeking for Michael Wirth to no longer serve as CEO. That's not the objective. Rather, that his ongoing service in a capacity where he is effectively his own boss on the board has not led to the kind of robust, independent, climate competent oversight that we need, and also for shareholders to vote against Ron Sugar should he be renominated as the lead independent director. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eli. So we're going to move into the question and answer session. So if you're online, you can feel free to submit a question in the box. And if you are in the room, feel free to raise your hand and Ivy will bring you the microphone. So I'll just kick it off. Could each of the panelists talk a little bit about some of the things that you considered short of voting against board members? And if you think that there should be a period of time longer than the next subsequent AGM when you do hold board members accountable. Eli, we can start with you.
Happy to. Let me give a very concrete example. There is going to be another shareholder proposal on the proxy at Chevron this season, calling on the company to issue Paris compliant targets for its capital expenditures. Now, this is an incredibly important shareholder proposal. Everyone in this room should vote for it. And we all know what will happen based on this track record of how the company would respond to yet another majority vote on that proposal, which is the company will come back and say what they already say, which is, don't worry, all of our oil is already burnable under the goals of the Paris Agreement, which, by the way, incidentally, is what many of their peers also say, which is just literally logically an impossibility. It can't all be burnable. It can't all be true. And so it's no longer enough to simply vote for yet the next year's proposal. Shareholders really need to be sending a message this year about the company, about the board's level of responsiveness to these past proposals.
Great. Edgar, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's interesting. For our purposes, I mean, we just outlined in terms of 3 years of engagement with a company, and yet at the same time, there's been no movement or no response. I think at this point in time, we were, forced to take the next steps that we're contemplating in terms of holding the directors accountable. So I do think that there is a runway where you exhaust your possibilities in terms of effective engagement, then you have to take the next step. Not something that we take lightly. We understand the issues related to that, and we feel that we were just backed up into this corner here. So I think that's where we're at right now, Lisa.
Great. And Gina, what are your thoughts on that?
Sure. I think we're in a similar position where we feel that we've engaged in a good faith effort to engage the company through requests for dialogue, investor letters from both the proponent, their ICCR members, the treasurers. With the Wendy's example, it's also a unique case where the board came out in support of the proposal, and that's part of the reason why the other majority, 95% of shareholders voted for it as well. So when the company itself came out in support of the proposal and then put out this report that was extremely non-responsive and did not engage with the proponent on the contents, I think the move towards the board accountability action was a clear step for us, and also something we aren't taking lightly. It's not a step we've taken in engagement in my 5 years with this organization. So I think there was a really clear case for this at Wendy's.
Great.
Lisa, I'm sorry. Can I
Sure.
just add, doing a withhold vote on a director is not something SEIU has ever really done. So for us to take, really to consider this is a new uncharted territory for us, right? So we're not exactly sure how it's going to shake out, but at the same time, we just feel like this, once again, we've tried engagement. It just hasn't gotten us where we needed to. And I think the other part of it is that we also understand that they've engaged with other organizations. And that's fine, and that's great, and we applaud that, right? But at the same time, as proponents of some of these shareholder resolutions, we feel that we also should be engaged with the company as well.
Thank you. Again, if anybody would like to ask a question, please raise your hand. And I see that we have John Keenan in the room, and John has quite a bit of back history on the effort to get Geo Group to disclose its lobbying activities. I was wondering if you wouldn't mind talking a little about that. Hang on just a second while we get your microphone.
Yeah, Geo has been engaged on this before and had received a majority vote in the past, and came to an agreement to produce a lobbying report with the Midwest Capuchins. And they produced a report or two, and then it just stopped. And going back on an agreement to produce this report, and then with SEIU's engagement, it just seems like there's a real lack of responsiveness, keeping a commitment, and it really just seems like there's no recognition that shareholders asked for this. I believe ISS didn't even recommend last year for the Geo vote, and it got 66%. And then when you look at their lobbying, I mean, it's just crazy at the state level, and they're not being responsive, disclosing it by state. So yeah, it's ongoing. So I think, the board is just
And how far
not
back?
listening.
How far back does that go? The
They've
Capuchins?
been engaged on this probably since 2012, 2013, and then said, oh, hey, we're going to do this. And actually, their peer, Core Civic, produces a report. And I think SEIU engaged them and said, okay, you did what we asked. So.
And what are some of the lobbying activities that Geo Group is engaged in at the state level for people who aren't familiar with that?
More or less just Florida. Florida is a very interesting example for political engagement. But in the past, there was involvement with ALEC, and but then after the Trayvon Martin case, they skedaddled out of there. But the American Bail Coalition is still in there. So in effect, they have people representing them still in the building with ALEC, which produces model legislation, which encourages more private prisons. So
Great. Okay, I don't see any questions, so I'm going to ask. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry, Bridget.
Hi, Bridget Murphy, Washington State Investment Board. Do you think there's a risk this is going to sound like I'm anti-shareholder proposal or something, but I'm not. I'm actually more just have been thinking that, is there any chance that the more take up, the more positive votes, majority votes we get, that we become desensitized, or companies become desensitized, and they aren't sort of, because I guess what I'm saying is I think that's the way the say on pay proposals have gone, where we're not really getting any follow up. And so it's like, on the one hand, as investors, we've been looking for this for a long time, these majority votes, but is there a higher chance now that companies are just going to be less responsive and like, this is just part of doing business?
Can I speak to that? I really appreciate that question, Bridget. In the United States, as we all know, shareholder proposals are non-binding. They're effectively a communications tool. They're effectively a way that shareholders collectively make our wishes known to companies. And they are, and always have been, only as strong as shareholders' collective willingness to back them up with votes on directors when companies fail to heed majority votes on them. Now, as we all know, a great many companies, even a majority of companies, absolutely engage productively, take actions towards what's necessary. We've heard several examples just now. Doesn't mean that a proponent and a company end up settling out all of the issues that they might have on the table, but they find a pathway that leads them to go forward. But we are also seeing exactly what you're describing, which is more and more companies. An asset manager I was speaking with about this recently put it just so perfectly. Some companies treat it like a science fair project, like for their junior attorney in the corporate secretary's office. And that's just simply not acceptable, right? And so what it means to actually have these majority votes mean something has to mean that when a company fails to heed them, that there are consequences for that board of directors.
Ed, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I don't. Thank you.
Okay, great. Rosanna.
Not to disagree with Bridget, but I think say on pay has been more effective than we give it credit for sometimes. But we can have that discussion another time. But is actually what I was going to ask about is votes against compensation, which you often can't sort of organize till the proxy comes out. But there were a number of them last year that were very successful. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on, people coming out and arguing against particular plans.
I would say, I mean, to me, it seems like if a company fails to respond to that, then you need to hold the comp committee accountable, right? I don't know if there are any efforts on that. We have been leaving the comp battle up to you, Rosanna, and you. I don't know. Do any of the panelists have anything to add on that?
No, I mean, I don't, but Rosanna, your organization, you guys have been doing amazing work. So we're very supportive of all the efforts there. But if there's anything that we can ever do to lift up the work, feel free to reach out to us. But I don't have anything else to add. Yeah.
John?
Yeah. Question on for Gina, and sorry if this was already covered. Trian Partners is the largest holder there. Have they responded? I mean, they've engaged with institutional investors before, I believe, at Procter & Gamble, and yeah, it would seem like with this. I'm sorry if that was covered before, but have they responded? And what's the response been?
Sure, we haven't engaged directly with Trian Partners or the Trian members that are highly represented on the Wendy's board, but I think that relationship is something we're considering in our research on what we're going to recommend in terms of director voting, as Wendy's has a issue of lack of independence due to the strong representation of Trian Partners on the board, both in the chair role, in the members that were appointed to the CSR committee, which would have oversight over the human rights and the supply chain issues. So back to your question, we haven't engaged with Trian directly, but are very aware of their influence on the board, and we'll be putting out research related to that.
Morgan.
Hello, Morgan Lamana series. I'm just reflecting on what I've heard the past couple of days from investors talking about when they get to this point if they're voting against directors, and a lot of it is based on ongoing engagement. Edgar, as you're talking about kind of getting to that point and companies engaging in good faith. And I'm just thinking, investors where they're working together through, say, collaborative engagements, hearing from one investor that the company isn't engaging how can that be enough for the other investor that, well, you're not engaging with my peer who's engaging on this issue that we work together on? How can I take that, your reflection of that they're not engaging in good faith? So I'm wondering if anyone on the panel has thoughts on kind of metrics of how we can say, maybe the company's attending meetings, but they're not engaging really in the subject matter, or, what level do they need to demonstrate that they're, really participating?
I'm sorry. Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think the other group that's been engaging with the company hasn't also had success in terms of what their engagement targets have been as well. So they're meeting, but they're not making progress. So it feels like, okay, well, you're not talking to us, you're talking to them, but we're not making progress. So what exactly are we doing? Right. And I think at that point in time, it just underscores once again, if the company is not serious about this work, then what other options do we have to do? And I think that to me, once again, goes back to moving forward and doing a withhold votes on directors. So.
Can I add to this? I think it's a tremendous question, Morgan, because I think it speaks to an underlying pattern of thought that I think exists in the minds of many investors that I think is born out of really a prior era in responsible investing and in ESG engagement. Where I think that for some investors, there's been some level of concern that if we vote against directors or say we're going to vote against directors, then the company will not meet with us. And of course, there was a moment in ESG, in the evolution of the ESG ecosystem, where a proponent or a concerned investor would be perhaps trying to engage a company on an issue and have no luck doing so, bless you, and really have no recourse. And that's just simply no longer the case today. It really kind of beggars belief that a company, let's take Chevron, for example. Let's take Exxon, for example, that after the success of last year's dissident slate, that the company would somehow have taken that as a sign that they were not going to engage with investors any further, right? Similarly, with a company like Chevron, it beggars belief that investors stepping out to hold the board accountable would somehow lead the company to think that the right strategic response would be to shut down engagement. That would be just a colossal strategic error. And I think it's one of these things where it's very important to be engaging on these questions, to be assessing these kind of metrics of engagement. And we're also just in a moment where companies' willingness to attend the meeting, when we're dealing with issues of this level of magnitude of both systemic and company-specific risk, a company's willingness to attend the meeting is simply no longer sufficient as a metric of whether or not they are adequately engaging with the concerns of investors. Attending the meeting is not the same thing as being responsive to the concerns. And that's really where we think that the focus should lie.
We have a question over here.
Hi, I'm Kristen Drake from Dimensional. I had a question about how do your organizations think about sort of the balance between shareholder proposals, which are obviously very company specific in terms of moving the needle, versus focusing efforts on the regulatory and policy system, which is really the only way you're going to get sort of consistent, comparable standards of disclosure and potentially action.
No, go right ahead.
It's a yes and for our organization, in the sense that it's absolutely the case that there's a whole series of these challenges, both on disclosures and on performance, that require policy change in order to actually achieve the kinds of conditions that would be sustainable for long-term shareholder value creation and risk mitigation. It's also the case that our policymaking system, at least in the United States, has demonstrated in the last several years that it's been particularly hamstrung or unable to actually achieve the level of policy outcomes. We're making some progress on the disclosures, that though a number of those are contested, but on a number of these issue fronts, that policymaking process has really been hamstrung. And so the question to us is not so much either or, but rather one of both and, meaning how can shareholders be expressing their view to companies to say, well, look, these are actually the outcomes that we expect. What we would love to see is a circumstance in which shareholders express those views to companies, and then companies actually then get on side on the policy level efforts, which then produces a virtuous cycle on the policy side, on the corporate performance side, and on the long-term shareholder value creation.
Gina?
Yeah, I had a comment about how we look at the UN guiding principles on business and human rights with both unique responsibilities and roles for states and for business. So I agree with Eli that it's a both and. We need to be engaging with corporations and in public policy engagements. But for the US agricultural workers, labor laws in the US often exempt them and don't apply. So it's a little bit difficult to do public policy advocacy in that area. So we're also engaging with the corporations directly about their roles and responsibilities, and are specifically pointing to the Fair Food Program as an effective worker-led model to join, because human rights and the supply chain risks have not been effectively managed by voluntary CSR initiatives. So that's how we're looking at it in this case.
Great, thanks, Gina. So I'm going to ask our panelists to do just a 1-minute wrap up of their final thoughts, and we'll go in the same order. So we'll start with Edgar.
Well, first and foremost, just wanted to express my gratitude to Majority Action CII for letting us be a part of this panel. I hope that the folks that are attending found it useful and informative. But I just do think that for us, in terms of, once again, the work that we're engaging on is uncharted territory for us as SEIU when we're doing our withhold vote. And we would hope that once we have the information available, we'll send it out to the folks in the CII distribution list, and that you would consider supporting our efforts there. Thank you.
I'd also like to echo the thanks to Majority Action and CII again, but would hope that those of you that attended this panel would take away from each of our initiatives the value in engaging the board and holding them accountable for lack of responsiveness to these proposals, and specifically on the Wendy's engagement. More information will be forthcoming on our director accountability considerations. And one closing point I wanted to make is the importance for investors to engage alongside and with worker organizations, communities, other impacted stakeholders to inform your advocacy and engagements with corporations. I think our work and longtime ICCR work alongside the Coalition of Immokalee Workers has been really, really fruitful and effective in our engagement.
I'm profoundly grateful to each and every one of you for being here and being a part of this conversation. This conversation really stands on the shoulders of giants and really is indebted to the incredible years of work that it has taken to produce the very first slide that my colleague Lisa showed, which is producing this level of majority votes on these proposals. And that's due to the support and championship of so many investors in this room, the leadership of groups like Ceres and ICCR and AFSCME and As You Sow. And we would not be in this position where we were getting these level of support, but for all of those efforts. And what we've heard today and what we've seen today is that these efforts will actually only mitigate investor risk and address investor concerns if and when shareholders are willing to hold boards accountable to actually making that happen. And so we are excited to be on this pathway with you all toward making that possible. Thank you so much.
Thanks for all of you for attending.
Thank you. Go team. Thank you.